After saving his daughter, a wealthy man invites an unknown woman to be his date at a wedding. When she arrives, no one expects the impact she will have. Secrets will be revealed, and what seemed like a mere formality turns into an unforgettable event where lives will be changed forever. John had always been a man who could buy anything he wanted, but his life took an unexpected turn when his daughter, Emily, was saved by a woman who seemingly had nothing. Grace, a homeless woman whose life seemed trapped in a cycle of misfortune, suddenly became the center of John's attention. Fate, which often plays with our expectations, brought Grace into his life in the most unexpected way. In that moment of shock and gratitude, John felt he owed her something more profound than money could offer. And so he made the proposal. "Be my girlfriend for an hour," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But this wasn't just any hour. It was during the wedding of his ex-wife, Sarah. At first glance, this request seems insane. Who in their right mind would make such an unusual proposal? But sometimes life demands actions from us that defy common sense, and it's precisely in those moments that we reveal our true selves. John knew that attending that wedding would be an emotional challenge, a confrontation with a past that he still carried on his shoulders, like a burden he couldn't shake off. Grace's presence, even if just for an hour, would be his way of showing Sarah that he had moved on, that his life had changed, even though, in reality, he was still recovering from the scars left by the divorce. Grace, on the other hand, found herself facing a difficult choice. She, who was used to being invisible to society, suddenly became a key player in an emotional power game. Accepting or rejecting John's proposal wasn't a simple decision. It wasn't just about money or gratitude. It involved her dignity, her self-perception, and the opportunity to live, if only for an hour, a life that seemed beyond her reach. And how could she ignore the irony of it all? A homeless woman, someone living on the streets being invited to the wedding of a socialite, a woman she would never have met under different circumstances. Life, with its twists and turns, offers unique opportunities, and it's up to us to decide how to seize them. John, despite his outward confidence, was vulnerable. The request he made to Grace was, in reality, a reflection of his own need for redemption. More than anything, he needed to show Sarah that he had rebuilt himself, that he was capable of moving forward, even though he still carried the pain of betrayal in his heart. John wanted to prove to himself that the love he once felt for Sarah had transformed into something different, perhaps into a form of overcoming. Consciously or not, he was seeking a new beginning, something that could erase the scars of the past. But deep down, he knew this was just an attempt to hide the wounds that were still open. John was an extremely successful businessman, but he faced a daily dilemma that many parents know all too well: balancing career and family. Emily, his daughter, was the center of his universe, the reason he woke up every morning and worked so hard. However, life had a cruel way of taking away what he valued most: time. And time is relentless, especially for those trying to juggle being a present father and maintaining a successful career. Even when he was home, John's mind often drifted to contracts, meetings, and important decisions, leaving Emily feeling as though she was competing with his work for his attention. John's routine was exhausting, and of course, it had its consequences. He knew that the time lost with Emily would never be recovered, that the moments when he wasn't present were actually memories he was failing to build with her. The pressure of work pushed him away from where he really wanted to be, but he justified it to himself by saying he was doing it all for Emily, to secure her future, her safety. However, deep down, he knew the price for this choice was too high. The small things, like listening to Emily talk about her day at school or watching a movie together, were sacrificed in the name of a future that had yet to come. John, like many fathers, desperately wanted to be a hero for his daughter. He wanted Emily to see him as someone strong, capable of overcoming any obstacle. But the reality was that most days he felt more like a ghost in her life, always present, but never really there. He remembered the times before the divorce, when he and Sarah were still together, and how they shared parenting responsibilities. Now, everything fell on his shoulders. He wanted to be a better father, But the incessant demands of work seemed to conspire against his efforts. Guilt was his constant companion, a shadow that followed him wherever he went. The love John felt for Emily was unquestionable, but he began to realize that love alone wasn't enough. He needed to be present, in both body and soul, to truly make a difference in his daughter's life. He recalled an occasion when Emily, still very young, had performed in a school play, and he couldn't attend because he was in a crucial meeting. The look of disappointment on her face when he tried to apologize was like a dagger to his heart. In that moment, he realized he didn't want his daughter to see him just as a provider, but as someone who genuinely cared about the small things that were part of her life. So John began to question the choices he'd been making. He knew that to change, he would need to make sacrifices. Perhaps it was time to reevaluate his priorities, to rethink what really mattered. Was he willing to give up some professional opportunities to be more present in Emily's life? The answer seemed obvious, but practice is always harder than theory. John knew he couldn't change the past, but there was still time to shape the future. And that future started with small changes, like setting aside one night a week to be exclusively with Emily. No interruptions, no distractions. These small actions, though they seemed insignificant, could be the beginning of a great new start. However, life always has surprises in store, and even the best intentions can be interrupted by unexpected events. While John planned how to reconnect with Emily, he had no idea that something was about to happen that would completely change the dynamics of his family life. This unpredictable and tragic event would force him to rethink everything he believed he knew about fatherhood, love, and sacrifice. And in this process, he would discover that sometimes the path to a true relationship with those we love involves challenges we never imagined we'd have to face. John never imagined his life would take the turn it did after his divorce from Sarah. They had fallen in love deeply, and like so many love stories, they believed happily ever after was within reach. However, their marriage couldn't withstand the pressures of real life and the challenges that arose. The divorce was a painful and bitter experience that left deep scars on John. The separation was marked by Sarah's betrayal with his business partner, Michael, something John never saw coming. The pain of that betrayal was like an open wound, one he tried to ignore, but that never really healed. After the divorce, John threw himself into his work. He believed that by dedicating himself even more to his career, he could forget the pain, could overcome the humiliation he felt. The office became his refuge, a place where he could control things, unlike his personal life, which had become chaotic and unpredictable. But deep down, he knew he was just running away, hiding behind stacks of papers and contracts, avoiding the emotions that insisted on resurfacing when he least expected them. Work was his way of numbing the pain, of not thinking about Sarah, Michael, and what they had done to him. The relationship with Sarah, which was once based on love and trust, now boiled down to coldness and formalities when they inevitably crossed paths. Their marriage had started as a promise of forever, but ended as a battle where both struggled to survive what was left of their relationship. John felt betrayed, not just as a husband, but as a person. The trust he once placed in Sarah was shattered, and he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about love and commitment. Sarah's betrayal didn't just hurt him, it made him doubt himself, his own worth. Over time, John realized that the divorce had changed the way he viewed the world, people, and even love. He became more cynical, more reserved, building walls around himself to protect against future disappointments. He stopped believing in the fairy tale of true love and began to see relationships as transactions, where each person sought what they wanted and often ended up leaving the other behind. The divorce taught him in a cruel way that trusting someone blindly could be dangerous, and he vowed to himself never to be vulnerable like that again. Even so, there were moments when John wondered if he could have done something differently, if he could have saved the marriage somehow. He would replay conversations, moments, trying to pinpoint where things started to go wrong. But the truth was that despite all his efforts, he never found a clear answer. What remained was the emptiness, the longing for what once was, and the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The divorce marked him in ways he was still discovering, But it also forced him to reassess his priorities, to question what really mattered in his life. However, life has its ways of surprising us, and even amid so much pain and disillusionment, new opportunities can arise. John, though he didn't realize it at the time, was about to enter a new phase of his life, a phase that would lead him to confront not only the ghosts of his past, but also the possibilities of a future he never imagined. And so, he would begin to understand that sometimes what seems like the end is actually just the beginning of something much greater. It was a day like any other, or at least that's what John thought as he was immersed in another marathon of work at the office. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. On the other end of the line, the panicked voice of the nanny informed him that Emily had disappeared. John's heart nearly stopped at that moment. How could it be that in the blink of an eye, his daughter, the most important person in his life, was in danger? He knew that Emily, being a curious and energetic child, had a habit of exploring. But this situation was different. The city was a big and dangerous place, especially for a small child. Meanwhile, Emily, unaware of the panic she was causing, wandered through the streets, fascinated by the new discoveries around her. What began as a small adventure to escape the monotony of her father's office soon turned into a dangerous situation. The bustling streets, full of cars and hurried people, were a whole new world for her, and her young mind couldn't foresee the danger approaching. In one moment she was in the middle of the street, and in the next, a car was speeding toward her at an alarming rate. Everything happened so quickly that for a brief second, it seemed like time had stopped. It was at this critical moment that Grace, a woman whose life had been marked by unimaginable challenges, entered the scene. For her, the daily struggle to survive on the streets had taught her to always be alert, to recognize dangerous situations almost instinctively, and it was this instinct that led her to act quickly without thinking about the consequences. She ran toward Emily and, in a gesture of pure courage and selflessness, pulled her out of the car's path at the last second. The emotional impact of that moment was so strong that even the passers-by who witnessed the scene were stunned. Grace, a woman society preferred to ignore, had suddenly become an unlikely heroine. When John finally found Emily, the relief he felt was mixed with overwhelming gratitude. He could hardly believe what had happened. Grace, a stranger, a woman living on the streets, had risked her life to save his daughter. In that moment, all his worries about work, the divorce, and even his personal problems seemed insignificant. All that mattered was that Emily was safe, and he knew he owed it to Grace. The irony of it all wasn't lost on John. The woman everyone ignored, whom he himself might have passed by without noticing, had become his savior. Grace, on the other hand, expected nothing in return. To her, saving Emily was a reflection of her own humanity, something that life on the streets hadn't yet taken away from her. But John couldn't let this act go unnoticed. He knew he needed to do something for Grace, something more than just saying thank you. He was determined to help her, to repay her in some way, not just because it felt like the right thing to do, but because deep down he knew that this encounter had a greater purpose. Life, with its twists and turns, seemed to be giving him a new chance, an opportunity to make a difference in the life of someone who, until that moment, had been invisible to the world. This encounter, which began with danger and fear, ended up becoming the start of something much bigger. John and Grace didn't know it yet, but that moment, when a life was saved, would be the starting point for a series of events that would change their lives forever. It was as if destiny were conspiring to bring them together, to give them a new chance, a new beginning, where together they could overcome challenges and build something new, something neither of them could have predicted. And so what started as an ordinary day turned into a turning point in the lives of John, Grace, and of course Emily. John couldn't get the moment Grace saved his daughter out of his mind. The scene replayed in his head like a movie, and each time he thought about her bravery, he felt compelled to do something more than just say thank you. He knew that, for Grace, that heroic act wasn't a job or something she expected a reward for, but John felt he owed her an opportunity, a chance to change her life. Life on the streets, so full of sacrifices and dangers, shouldn't be the final destination for a woman like Grace, someone who had shown such noble character in a moment of need. And with that thought, John decided to offer her a job. When John approached Grace with the offer, he knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation. Grace, on her side, was skeptical. She wasn't used to receiving kindness, especially from a wealthy man who, in other circumstances, might have ignored her completely. However, John's sincerity, his genuine gratitude, made Grace consider the offer. He proposed that she work at his home helping with household tasks, a simple job, but one that would provide the stability she so desperately needed. Grace hesitated, knowing that accepting would mean leaving behind the life that, although harsh, was the only one she knew. Grace's decision to accept the job was a monumental step, not just for her but for John as well. For him, this was an opportunity to give back, to do something meaningful that could truly change someone's life for the better. For Grace, it was a chance to start over, to reconnect with a part of herself that had been lost over the years. However, not everyone saw the situation with the same eyes. Jessica, John's secretary, who had long harbored feelings for him, saw Grace as a threat. Grace's arrival stirred up insecurities in Jessica that she could barely disguise. Jessica, always efficient and loyal, began to question John's motivations. Why was he so determined to help this woman he barely knew? Could it be that he felt something more than simple gratitude? Jessica couldn't accept the idea that John might be falling for Grace, someone who, in her opinion, didn't belong in their world. Her envy and jealousy grew with each passing day, and she decided that she would do anything to push Grace away, to protect what she believed was rightfully hers. And so, Jessica began to plot, under the guise of professionalism, but driven by jealousy. While John was busy with his responsibilities, and Grace was trying to adapt to her new life, Jessica began to plant seeds of doubt. She hinted that Grace might not be trustworthy, that perhaps she was hiding something, that her past on the streets could bring problems. John, despite his gratitude toward Grace, began to have second thoughts. He wanted to believe he was doing the right thing, but doubt started to creep into his mind. However, Emily, who had formed a special bond with Grace, wasn't willing to let these intrigues affect the new family dynamic. And it was Emily, with her innocence and purity, who would eventually reveal the truth. John was about to discover that, despite the best intentions, significant changes in someone's life are rarely simple or free of complications. Grace's presence in his home and life brought to the surface a range of emotions and conflicts he hadn't anticipated. However, what he didn't yet know was that these same complications would lead him to question much more than just Grace's loyalty. He would begin to reassess everything he believed about trust, love, and the true meaning of family. The relationship between Grace and Jessica at work quickly turned into an emotional and distrustful minefield. Jessica, who had always been a calm and efficient presence in John's professional life, now felt threatened. Jealousy, that treacherous emotion that corrodes rationality, began to dominate her thoughts. She watched Grace's every move, looking for any slip-up, any reason she could use to incriminate her. To Jessica, Grace's presence wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to what she believed she had built with John over the years. Grace, on the other hand, was simply trying to find her place in a world that was still foreign to her. She felt Jessica's gaze at every corner, the weight of distrust in every gesture. It wasn't easy, especially for someone who had faced so many hardships in life, to deal with the veiled hostility that emanated from the secretary. However, Grace was determined to do her best, not for herself, but for John, and most importantly for Emily, with whom she had created a special bond. She knew that John's trust was something precious, and she didn't intend to betray that trust, even if it meant enduring Jessica's attempts at sabotage. Driven by a mix of fear and jealousy, Jessica decided to take action. She began planting false evidence, small hints that Grace might be acting in bad faith. A missing object here, a misplaced document there, all carefully orchestrated to raise suspicion. John, busy with his business and still dealing with the emotional scars of his past, didn't immediately notice what was happening. But the effects began to show. The tension between Grace and Jessica became palpable, and John started to question whether he had made the right choice in bringing Grace so close to his personal life. However, as they say, the truth always comes to light, And in Grace's case, it was Emily who brought that truth to the surface. The girl who saw Grace as a maternal figure and friend noticed Jessica's little intrigues and, in her innocence, decided to confront the situation. Emily spoke openly to her father, questioning him about the changes she had noticed. Her words, simple and direct, made John stop and reflect. He realized that perhaps he had been influenced by Jessica's manipulations, someone he had always trusted, but who now revealed a side of herself he didn't know. When John confronted Jessica, he was forced to see the reality. He discovered that the secretary, driven by jealousy, had woven a web of lies in an attempt to get rid of Grace. The disappointment was immense. John, who had already suffered betrayal in the past, now faced another, coming from someone he considered loyal. Jessica's dismissal was inevitable, but the bitterness remained. John realized that to protect those he loved, he would need to be more vigilant, more careful about who he allowed to get close to his family. And so Grace, who had entered his life so unexpectedly, became an even more important and trustworthy presence. However, this experience served as a painful reminder that trust is something fragile and precious. John understood that to move forward, he would need to be more aware of the motivations of the people around him. The incident with Jessica was a hard blow, but also a valuable lesson. And in this process, he began to see Grace in a new light, not just as the woman who saved his daughter, but as someone he could truly trust, someone who, despite all the adversities, remained true and loyal. And thus the path was cleared for new emotions and feelings to begin to blossom in his heart. As time passed, John began to realize that his relationship with Grace had transformed into something much deeper than he could have ever imagined. What started as a simple act of gratitude for his daughter's life was now blossoming into something more complex, yet at the same time simpler: love. John, who had closed himself off to this kind of feeling after the divorce, found himself surprised by a new wave of emotions that he thought were out of his reach. Grace's presence in his life not only brought comfort and stability, but also a sense of renewal, as if he were rediscovering a part of himself that had been lost. Grace, on her side, also noticed this change. She, who had spent so much time struggling to survive, now found herself in an environment where care and respect were abundant. The daily interactions with John and Emily brought back feelings she had buried long ago. Grace began to feel something for John, something that went beyond gratitude. It was a feeling that grew subtly but steadily, like a flower blooming through concrete. And although she had her insecurities, especially considering the social gap between them, she couldn't deny what her heart was beginning to tell her. John initially tried to ignore these feelings. He was aware of the challenges that would arise if he followed this path, especially considering the different lives they had led. But, as with anything involving the heart, ignoring it wasn't a viable option. The connection he felt with Grace was real, tangible, and he knew that at some point he would have to confront these feelings, both with himself and with her. John began to find ways to be closer to Grace, to get to know her better, to understand the layers of her personality that were still a mystery to him. The small moments they shared, the conversations, the glances, the kind gestures, all began to build a bridge between their souls. John found himself laughing more, feeling lighter when he was with Grace. He realized he was, in fact, falling in love, something he believed was no longer possible after all he had been through. And this realization scared him, but at the same time it filled him with hope. He didn't want to rush anything, but he also didn't want to miss the opportunity to explore what could be a new chance at happiness, one he hadn't expected to find. Grace also felt this growing closeness, but her own fears and doubts made her hesitate. She wondered if John could truly love her, if he saw in her something more than just the woman who saved his daughter. The fear of being rejected, of getting hurt again, made her hold back, even when everything in her heart wanted to move forward. However, John's actions, his care and consideration, began to break down the barriers she had built over the years. She started to realize that maybe this unexpected love was exactly what both of them needed to heal their wounds and move forward. As the days passed, The relationship between John and Grace strengthened, and the love they felt for each other became impossible to ignore. They knew they were about to cross an important line, one that would change their lives forever. However, there were still many challenges ahead, unresolved issues and pasts that needed to be confronted. But at the same time, there was the certainty that together they could overcome anything. And so the seed of a new beginning, planted under such unusual circumstances, began to bloom, bringing with it the promise of a future filled with love and hope. John thought nothing could surprise him anymore, but the invitation to his ex-wife Sarah's wedding with Michael caught him off guard. When the envelope landed on his desk, he initially thought it was some kind of cruel joke. However, upon opening it and seeing Sarah and Michael's names together, reality hit him hard. It was official. Sarah, the woman he once deeply loved, was getting married again, and this time to the man who betrayed him. A whirlwind of emotions overwhelmed him: anger, sadness, a renewed sense of betrayal, but also a strange feeling of acceptance. He knew he had moved past the worst of it, but that didn't mean seeing this new chapter unfold would be easy. As he held the invitation in his hands, John wondered if he should attend. On one hand, he didn't want to subject himself to further humiliation, to be a silent observer of a ceremony that represented everything he had lost. On the other hand, something inside him, perhaps a remnant of pride or a need to show that he had moved on, urged him to go. And it was in this moment of indecision that he had an idea. If he was going, he wouldn't go alone. He would take Grace. Not just as a simple companion, but as his girlfriend. The idea seemed crazy, but at the same time, it was irresistible. John knew that bringing Grace to the wedding would be shocking to everyone present, especially to Sarah and Michael. He imagined their expressions of surprise, perhaps even discomfort, when they saw the woman who had once been a stranger now by his side. The decision to bring Grace wasn't just about making a statement, but also about showing that he had moved on from the past and was building something new and different. And beyond that, he felt that Grace deserved to be by his side, not as a tool to provoke jealousy, but as a partner he was beginning to trust deeply. When John shared the idea with Grace, she was surprised, but also hesitant. Attending Sarah's wedding, knowing the past she and John shared, would be a difficult test for anyone. But the idea of being by John's side at this moment, of facing her fears and insecurities, attracted her in a way she couldn't explain. Grace knew that by accepting, she would be committing to entering a world that, until recently, was completely foreign to her. But at the same time, she felt that this was part of her new beginning, a chance to show everyone, and herself, that she was more than the circumstances of her past. The preparations for the wedding moved forward, and John and Grace began planning how to present themselves at the event. Grace was nervous, but also determined. She knew this would be an opportunity to assert herself, to show that her worth didn't depend on others' approval. John, on his part, was torn between the excitement of making a bold statement and the fear that it might bring up old wounds. However, the decision was made, and they were both ready to face whatever came their way. They knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together. On the day of the wedding, John and Grace arrived at the event with a quiet confidence, but the curious and surprised looks didn't go unnoticed. Sarah and Michael were the most shocked to see them together. John, who had once been devastated by betrayal, was now there, alongside a woman who, though unknown to all, had become a central figure in his life. The tension was palpable, but there was also a sense of silent victory. John and Grace, each in their own way, were ready to face any challenge that day might bring, knowing that what truly mattered was what they felt for each other, not what others thought. The wedding, with all its expected pomp and circumstance, was far from serene for John and Grace. From the moment they entered, they felt the stares and whispers around them. Sarah, who had always been a proud woman, couldn't hide her discomfort at seeing her ex-husband accompanied by Grace. The tension between them was palpable, but John remained steadfast, determined not to let this event shake him. What he didn't expect, however, was that Sarah, in an act of sheer resentment, would be capable of turning that day into a true spectacle of humiliation. During the reception, when everyone expected speeches celebrating love and union, Sarah took the microphone. What started as a conventional speech soon turned into something much darker. With a smile that mixed bitterness and triumph, Sarah began to talk about Grace, but not as John's new companion. Instead, she spoke of Grace as someone she knew from before. Sarah's words were carefully chosen to wound, revealing Grace's past as a homeless woman, someone who, according to Sarah, didn't belong here, among us. The room fell into an awkward silence as Sarah continued, with disturbing detail, to expose the hard life Grace had lived on the streets. John felt his blood boil as he listened to Sarah's cruel words. He knew that Grace's past was something she was trying to overcome, something that still haunted her. Seeing that past being exposed so publicly and disrespectfully was a low blow, even for Sarah. He looked at Grace, expecting to see pain or shame on her face, but what he found was something different. Grace, although clearly affected, was determined not to let Sarah's words destroy her. She had faced worse things in life, and although these memories were painful, they were also part of what had made her strong. Sarah's revelation left the guests exchanging uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Some were clearly uncomfortable, others simply curious. But the reaction that really mattered was Grace's. Instead of running away or hiding, she stood up and, with surprising calm, took the microphone from Sarah's hands. With a firm voice, she spoke about her past, not as a confession but as a declaration of resilience. She explained how those hard years had shaped her, how they had taught her to be resilient and never give up, no matter how tough things got. Grace turned Sarah's attack into an opportunity to show her true strength. The impact of Grace's speech was immediate. The silence in the room turned into murmurs of admiration and respect. John felt a wave of pride and love swell inside him. He knew Grace was an extraordinary woman, but seeing her face that situation with her head held high, with such dignity, only reinforced his feelings. Sarah, on the other hand, was left speechless, realizing that her plan to humiliate Grace had backfired spectacularly. Instead of bringing her down, Sarah had only strengthened Grace's image, showing everyone that despite her past, she was a woman of great worth. As the guests began to applaud, John took Grace's hand and led her out of the reception, away from the curious eyes. They knew that moment had changed something fundamental between them. The love they felt for each other, which was already strong, now seemed unbreakable. They had faced a storm together and emerged from it even more united. However, what neither of them knew was that this revelation, as painful as it was only the beginning of a series of discoveries that would change their lives forever. The night, already filled with intense emotions, took a tragic turn that no one could have predicted. After Grace's speech, the two of them left the reception, seeking a moment of peace and privacy away from the stares and judgments of the other guests. However, what should have been a moment of relief quickly turned into a nightmare. Grace, still shaken by the revelations and the tension of the evening, decided to take a walk to clear her mind. John, concerned, tried to convince her to stay, but Grace insisted that she needed some time alone. He hesitated but eventually gave in, believing she would return soon. As she walked through the dark and sparsely populated streets, Grace became lost in her thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened. The pressure of the event, combined with the painful memories of her past, weighed heavily on her mind like an approaching storm. Each step felt heavier than the last, until, in a moment of pure distraction, Grace didn't notice a truck speeding toward her. The driver, unable to react in time, slammed on the brakes, but couldn't avoid the impact. The sound of metal colliding with Grace's body echoed through the street, a noise that seemed to announce the worst. John, who was anxiously waiting for Grace to return, was alerted by the screams of some people passing by. His heart raced as he ran toward the sounds, fearing what he might find. When he arrived, the scene that unfolded before his eyes was devastating. Grace was lying on the ground, motionless, with an expression of pain and surprise still etched on her face. John knelt beside her, desperate, feeling as though the world was crumbling around him. All he could do was hold her hand and beg her to stay with him. As the sound of approaching ambulance sirens grew louder, the ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions for John. He couldn't shake the overwhelming fear that consumed his heart. Every passing second felt like an eternity, and memories of Grace so full of life flooded his mind. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Grace was rushed into the emergency room. John, unable to follow, was left behind in the waiting area, his head buried in his hands. He knew the situation was dire, but he refused to believe that anything could take her from him now, just when they were beginning to build something together. The following hours were excruciating. John received little information as the doctors worked to stabilize Grace. Finally, one of the surgeons approached with a grave expression. Grace had survived the impact, but the damage was severe. She was in a coma, her body fighting to recover, but there were no guarantees she would wake up. The news was a devastating blow to John. The love he had rediscovered, the hope of a new beginning, everything seemed to be crumbling before him. However, he refused to give up. Even though Grace was unconscious, he promised himself he would stay by her side, waiting, hoping and believing she would come back to him. The tragic accident not only shook John, but also brought to light emotions and revelations he wasn't prepared to face. As he remained by Grace's side day after day, he began to realize that this difficult moment could be the catalyst for even greater changes. The love he felt for Grace was real, but he knew that to move forward, it would take more than just hope. He would have to face the challenges that lay ahead, not just for himself, but for Grace and the life they both dreamed of building together. And though the future was uncertain, John was determined to fight for that love no matter what it took. As Grace fought for her life in the hospital, a long-buried secret began to surface, bringing to light truths that no one had anticipated. During the days following the accident, John's constant presence at the hospital caught everyone's attention, including that of an elderly man who by coincidence was also at the hospital that night. This man, an established businessman who had attended Sarah and Michael's wedding, was intrigued to see John by Grace's side, a woman he never imagined he would encounter again. Grace's face, even bruised, stirred painful memories in the elderly man, memories of a past he thought he had left behind. This man, known as Mr. Thompson, had been one of the most successful businessmen in the city, but his business achievements were shadowed by personal tragedies. Decades earlier, he had a daughter who mysteriously disappeared as a baby, a tragedy that marked him deeply and that he never fully overcame. The circumstances of the disappearance were shrouded in mystery, and all attempts to find the child had failed. Now, seeing Grace, a woman whose story he knew only superficially, Mr. Thompson began to feel a strange connection, an instinct that drove him to investigate further. Private detectives were hired, and after a series of investigations and DNA tests, the truth finally came to light. Grace was, in fact, Mr. Thompson's biological daughter, the child he had lost so many years ago. The revelation was a shock to everyone involved, especially to John, who was already dealing with the fear of losing Grace forever. The story of how Grace ended up on the streets, separated from her true family, began to unfold, revealing a series of tragic events involving abduction, abandonment, and a life of hardships that Grace had endured alone. For Mr. Thompson, the news was both a blessing and a curse. He had finally found his daughter, but she was on the brink of death, and the time he hoped to recover with her seemed to be slipping away. He began to spend more and more time by Grace's side, alongside John, hoping for a miracle that would bring his daughter back. A bond began to form between them, not just because of their blood relation, but also due to the shared pain of lives marked by loss and sacrifice. And as they waited, a new family began to take shape around that hospital bed. John, on the other hand, found himself in an emotional dilemma. He had always known Grace was special, but discovering that she was the long-lost daughter of a powerful and influential man like Mr. Thompson brought new complications. He began to question his place in Grace's life, fearing that when she woke up, she might prefer to be with the family she had finally found. However, he knew his feelings for her were real, and he was determined to support her, no matter how things turned out. Love, he had learned, wasn't just about being there for the good times, it was about facing the toughest challenges together. The revelation of these family ties added a new layer of complexity to the story of Grace and John. As they awaited Grace's awakening, both John and Mr. Thompson realized that their lives would never be the same. And while the future was uncertain, there was a new hope, a new possibility for redemption and healing. The family, which had been just a distant idea for Grace, was now within reach. But for this to become reality, she would need to wake up. She would need to return to those who already loved her deeply, even though they had just discovered her. The days turned into weeks, and John remained by Grace's side, waiting for any sign of improvement. The hospital had become a sort of second home for him, a place where each beat of Grace's heart brought new hope. Mr. Thompson, now aware that he had found his long-lost daughter, also stayed close by. He was determined to make up for the lost time, but he knew that, for this, a miracle would be needed. The doctors weren't offering many guarantees, but John and Mr. Thompson refused to give up. They knew Grace was strong, that she had overcome unimaginable hardships in the past, and they believed she could win this battle too. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived. A small movement, a flutter of her eyelids, was the first sign that Grace was returning. John, who was at her side at that moment, could hardly believe it. He called the doctors, and soon the entire team was in action. Grace's awakening was slow, as if she were emerging from a long, heavy sleep, but each small step forward was celebrated as a victory. When she finally opened her eyes and looked at John, he felt a wave of relief and emotion that nearly overwhelmed him. The woman he loved was back, and with her the hope of a future together. Grace was still weak and disoriented, but gradually she began to understand what had happened. The memories came back slowly, and with them, the reality of her new life. She discovered that she was no longer alone, that there were people who deeply cared for her. John and Mr. Thompson were always by her side, supporting her every step of the way on her long road to recovery. For Grace, this was a new and strange experience. She, who had always faced difficulties alone, now found herself surrounded by love and care. And it was this love, this support network, that gave her the strength she needed to start rebuilding herself. Grace's recovery was a slow and painful process, but it was also a journey of rediscovery. With each passing day, she grew stronger, not just physically but emotionally as well. She began to reassess her life, to realize that despite all the difficulties, she had a new chance at happiness, to build a life that once seemed impossible. Mr. Thompson, for his part, was determined to make up for the lost years. He offered Grace not only his support, but also the opportunity to reconnect with her roots, to get to know the family she never knew she had. John and Grace, now more united than ever, began to plan a future together. They knew there were still many challenges ahead, but they were determined to face them side by side. The accident, though tragic, had become a turning point, an opportunity for both to reevaluate their lives and decide what truly mattered. For John, the love he felt for Grace was the greatest proof that even in the hardest situations, there was always the possibility of a new beginning. And for Grace, the support of John and Mr. Thompson was what gave her the strength to keep fighting. Over time, Grace returned to being the strong and determined woman John had first met. But now she was different. She was no longer the woman living on the streets, struggling to survive. Now she was someone who had found her place in the world, someone who was willing to face any challenge to protect those she loved. And as she prepared for this new phase of her life, Grace knew that despite all the scars, she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She had overcome the past, and now she was ready to build a future alongside John, a future that, finally, seemed full of possibilities. We've reached the end of this intense and transformative journey, but the true story has only just begun. Following the lives of John and Grace isn't just about observing fictional characters, it's about reflecting on the complexities and challenges that all of us face at some point in our lives. Their journey teaches us that, no matter how cruel fate may seem, there is always the possibility of redemption, of finding our way back, of rebuilding what was lost. However, this rebuilding doesn't happen by chance. It demands a deep commitment to truth, to forgiveness, and to the willingness to confront the darkest pains head-on. Think about the scars you carry, the betrayals you've endured, the losses that still echo in your soul. Ask yourself, to what extent have these experiences shaped your decisions? Are they holding you back from moving forward, from loving again, from trusting others? Just as John had to learn to let go of the past to allow the present to flourish, maybe it's time for you to do the same. This doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing the pain, but rather using it as a catalyst for a new beginning, where hope isn't just a word, but a driving force. Grace shows us that even those who have been marginalized, forgotten by the world, have within them an immense power of resilience and transformation. Her life on the streets, far from being merely a period of suffering, forged a strength within her that many of us have yet to discover. This strength is the ability to look into the darkness and find, even if only a thread, a light to follow. And what about you? Where is your light? Where are the opportunities for a fresh start that you may have ignored out of fear or insecurity? The time to act is now, to reclaim those opportunities and turn them into tangible realities. And we cannot forget the importance of the bonds we form along the way. John, Grace, and Mr. Thompson discovered that the true value of a family isn't just in blood ties, but in the choices we make and the people we choose to have by our side. Bonds of love, friendship, and trust are built day by day, and it's these bonds that sustain us during the toughest times. Who are the people in your life who deserve your commitment, your trust? And more importantly, are you nurturing those relationships, or are you allowing time and distance to erode them? The invitation for you is this: reflect deeply on your own journey. Look at the battles you faced and ask yourself how they can guide you toward a stronger, more courageous future. Share your story with us in the comments. How can you apply these lessons in your life? Transformation begins with the decision not just to learn, but to act. And as you consider these challenges, remember that you're not alone on this journey. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and let's continue together, exploring the depths of life, love, and the true meaning of overcoming.